Apparently the only thing keeping us from liberty is a few more ideas.
A few more ideas. I mean, it's so confusing, isn't it? So much going on, so much to say, and all of it happening so quickly. The pace of repression outstrips our ability to understand it, and that is the real trick of the imperial thought machine. It's easier to hide behind 40 atrocities than a single incident. But they have a fight on their hands, don't they? Our elemental rights are such a simple thing to hold, they will have to shake the galaxy awfully hard to loosen our grip.
Welcome back to the Dialectic Dose. I'm your host, Austin Constantino.
Why do guys like you and I know what a teve is? Is this essential to our survival in the hunter-gatherer sense of the word? No. What are we then?
Consumers.
Right. We are consumers. We are byproducts of a lifestyle obsession.
It is the international system of currency which determines the totality of life on this planet. That is the natural order.
In our first episode, we began uncovering the interconnected nature of the crisis facing our world today. From environmental collapse to economic inequality, from the rise of fascism to the hollowing of democracy, we established that these aren't isolated problems, but symptoms of the same underlying superstructure, capitalism. Today, we dive deeper. We'll examine what capitalism actually is, not merely as it appears to us in our daily lives, but in its essence. We'll peel back the layers of the mystification that surrounds it, look at how it manifests as ideology, and confront the arguments made in its defense. Finally, we'll explore the alternatives that offer us a path toward reclaiming our full humanity. This is not an academic exercise. Understanding capitalism is necessary for anyone who seeks to transform it. As the philosopher Spinoza once noted, neither to laugh, nor to weep, nor to detest, but to understand. Yet understanding itself is a revolutionary act when the system depends on obscuring its own nature. So let us begin with how capitalism appears to most of us in our everyday experience. For most of us listening, capitalism manifests in the mundane structures of our working lives. It's the boss who monitors your productivity. It's the timesheet you fill out meticulously at the end of each week. It's the manager who denies your request for time off. It's the constant anxiety of wondering if you'll be able to pay next month's rent or mortgage. It's the desperate text message sent to coworkers asking if they can cover your shift because your child is sick. It's the gig economy apps on our phone that promise freedom while extracting ever more value from your labor. It's the big box stores where you shop because you can't afford to buy local. It's the factory jobs that have disappeared from your community, shipped overseas in search of cheaper labor. On this immediate level, capitalism appears simply as an economic arrangement, a system where workers sell their ability to work in exchange for wages. It presents itself as natural, inevitable, the only possible way to organize human productive activity. It surrounds us like water surrounds a fish, making it difficult to even conceptualize alternatives. This system has created a hierarchy of work where some forms of labor are deemed dignified and others degrading. The lawyer in the downtown high-rise is considered inherently more valuable than the janitor who cleans that same building after hours. The tech entrepreneur is celebrated while the warehouse worker who fulfills the orders is rendered invisible. The financial analyst is rewarded lavishly while the child care worker struggles to make ends meet. Capitalism encourages us to internalize these hierarchies. It tells us that our worth as human beings is tied to our productivity, our skill set, our ability to generate profit for others. It whispers that those who succeed do so purely through merit and hard work, while those who struggle have only themselves to blame for their failures. This is how capitalism appears to us, but appearance is not essence. What lies beneath this everyday experience? What is capitalism, really? At its core, capitalism is not simply a neutral economic system, but a specific mode of production defined by several key characteristics. First, capitalism is characterized by private ownership of the means of production. Factories, offices, machinery, land, and resources, these are all the means of production, and they're used to create goods and services, but are owned not by those who use them to create value, the workers, but by a separate class of capitalists. This private ownership creates an immediate power imbalance, as the vast majority must sell their labor power to access the means of production and thus to survive. Second, capitalism is driven by the profit motive. Production occurs not to meet human needs, but to generate profit for owners. A pharmaceutical company doesn't develop medications primarily to heal the sick. It develops them to create shareholder value. If a life-saving drug isn't profitable enough, it won't be produced, regardless of how many lives it might save. Now, this isn't because capitalists are individually evil, though there are quite a few who I think could be labeled as such. But it's primarily because the system itself demands profit maximization above all else. Third, capitalism relies on the exploitation of labor. Now, this isn't a moral judgment, it's a technical reality. Workers create more value during their working hours than they receive back in wages. This surplus value is appropriated by the capitalist class as profit. Without this appropriation, capitalism simply could not function. So, no matter how kind any individual employer might be, the system itself depends on paying workers less than the value they create. In other words, exploitation. Fourth, capitalism requires constant expansion. It cannot remain stable. It must grow or die. This imperative for endless growth on a finite planet is the root cause of our ecological crisis. The capitalist is compelled by competition to reinvest profits, to expand production, to find new markets, and to commodify more and more aspects of human life and the natural world. Finally, fifth, capitalism commodifies everything it touches. Relationships, experiences, emotions, even time itself, all become products to be bought and sold on the market. Our most intimate human connections become mediated through commodities. We express love through purchased gifts. We seek meaning through consumer experiences, and we measure our own worth through financial metrics. This essence of capitalism, private ownership, profit-driven production, labor exploitation, endless expansion, and universal commodification, remains hidden from us most of the time. It is obscured by ideology, by the stories capitalism tells about itself. Ideology is not simply a set of ideas. It's a lived relationship to reality. It's a system of beliefs and practices that shapes how we perceive the world. Capitalist ideology naturalizes what is in fact historical and contingent. It presents the current organization of society as inevitable, eternal, simply the way things are. This naturalization begins with the commodity itself. We encounter products on the market as things with inherent value, obscuring the social relationships and labor processes that create them. Karl Marx called this commodity fetishism, the way the commodity form disguises human relationships as relationships between things. To put it more simply, let's use an analogy. When you purchase a smartphone, you don't see the Congolese miners, most of the time children, who extract the rare minerals for this phone. You don't see the Chinese factory workers who assemble the components. You don't see the software engineers who design the operating system. You don't see the delivery drivers who transported it to the store. There are many, many other potential ways to look at all the labor value behind this commodity, but I think you understand. What you end up only seeing is a thing with a price tag. The vast web of human labor and exploitation that produced it remains invisible to you. This fetishism extends beyond individual commodities to the market itself. The market appears as a natural force governed by its own autonomous laws, supply and demand, the invisible hand, things like that, but rather than as a historically specific system created and maintained by human beings. Economic crises appear as natural disasters rather than predictable consequences of capitalism's internal contradictions. Capitalist ideology also shapes our understanding of ourselves. It promotes a vision of human nature as inherently competitive, self-interested. It tells us that we are primarily consumers and sellers of labor power rather than social beings with the capacity for cooperation, care, collective flourishing, and mutual aid. And perhaps most insidiously, capitalism colonizes our imagination. It limits our ability to envision alternatives by insisting that any attempt to move beyond capitalism will inevitably lead to totalitarianism or economic collapse. There is no alternative, we're often told, even as the system hurdles us toward ecological catastrophe and deepening inequality and violence across the world. Now, this ideological structure doesn't exist in isolation. It intersects with and reinforces other systems of domination, like racism, sexism, imperialism, to name a few, creating a complex web of oppression that serves the interests of capital accumulation. I want to take some time now to examine how capitalist ideology manifests in concrete forms of domination and destruction. Racism, far from being incidental to capitalism, has been essential to its development. The transatlantic slave trade provided the initial accumulation of capital that fueled European industrialization. Colonial exploitation of the global South transferred vast wealth to imperial centers. And today, racial hierarchies continue to segment the working class, creating pools of hyper-exploitable labor and preventing class solidarity across racial lines. Consider how racial ideologies justified the theft of land from indigenous peoples, or the extraction of resources from colonized nations, or the super exploitation of racialized labor. These weren't mere cultural prejudices, but functional aspects of capital accumulation. The devaluation of Black and brown lives made possible forms of exploitation that would have been unthinkable if applied to those considered fully human. And in recent history, that typically means white. Similarly, gender oppression has been integral to capitalism. Women's unpaid domestic labor, like raising children, maintaining households, caring for the elderly, that reproduces the workforce at no cost to capital. When women entered the formal workforce, they faced discrimination, harassment, and lower wages, again creating a segment of workers from whom greater surplus value could be extracted. The commodification of women's bodies through advertising, pornography, and sex work represents yet another way capitalism transforms human relationships into profit-generating enterprises. Environmental destruction is not an unfortunate side effect of capitalism, but a necessary consequence of its logic. The imperative for endless growth, the treatment of nature as merely a resource to be exploited rather than the foundation of all life, the externalization of environmental costs, all of these flow directly from capitalist relations of production. And each year, more forest is cleared, more ocean is acidified, more species go extinct, more carbon is pumped into the atmosphere. Not because individuals don't care about the environment, but because the system's internal logic demands ever-expanding production and consumption, regardless of ecological limits. Now, imperialism represents the global dimension of capitalism, or as Lenin put it, the highest form of capitalism. As capital seeks ever greater returns, it must continuously expand into new territories, extracting resources and exploiting labor on a worldwide scale. Military interventions, economic sanctions, coups against democratically elected governments that challenge capital's interests, All of these are not aberrations. They are standard operating procedures for maintaining the global capitalist order. The history of the 20th century is littered with examples. There's Iran in 1953, or Guatemala in 1954, Congo in 1961, Chile in 1973. There are countless others. Nations that attempted to chart an independent economic course to use their resources for the benefit of their own people rather than foreign capital, they found themselves targets of imperial aggression. And this pattern continues today, though often through more sophisticated means of financial coercion and soft power, sometimes called neo-colonialism. Finally, fascism emerges, not in opposition to capitalism, but actually as its last line of defense when facing serious challenge. When democratic means of preserving capitalist property relations fail, sections of the ruling class turn to authoritarian solutions. They mobilize the petty bourgeoisie and segments of the working class through nationalist, racist, traditionalist appeals, directing their legitimate economic anxieties towards scapegoated minorities rather than the system itself. And we see this dynamic playing out today in the rise of far-right movements across the globe, or even amongst so-called leftists in the US and West, turning a blind eye to genocide and the peak of expansionist imperialism from Israel. As neoliberalism's promises of prosperity ring increasingly hollow, and as inequality deepens and social safety nets fray, fascist movements offer simple explanations and fake solutions that preserve the fundamental structures of capitalism while pretending to challenge the status quo. All of these manifestations, racism, sexism, environmental destruction, imperialism, and fascism, they all stem from the same root: a system that prioritizes profit over people, that treats the majority of humanity in the natural world as resources to be exploited rather than as inherently valuable. But capitalism doesn't just present itself as natural and inevitable. It actively defends itself through a series of arguments that deserve careful examination. Let's engage with the strongest arguments made in defense of capitalism and subject them to critical scrutiny. Now, there could be a variety of arguments for capitalism, all, in my opinion, refutable, but I just want to focus on some popular ones here. Argument number one: capitalism has created unprecedented prosperity and lifted billions out of poverty. This argument contains a kernel of truth. Capitalism has indeed overseen a massive expansion of productive forces and, in some regions, rising living standards. However, this narrative obscures several crucial facts. First, much of the poverty alleviation claimed by capitalism's defenders involves changing definitions and statistical manipulations. The World Bank's poverty line of $1.90 per day is far below what's needed for basic subsistence in most places. Using more realistic measures, global poverty remains staggeringly high. Second, the gains that have occurred came largely through the struggles against capitalism, not because of it. The 8-hour workday, workplace safety regulations, child labor laws, minimum wages, these were not benevolent gifts from capitalists, but victories won through bitter class struggle, often at the cost of workers' lives. Third, capitalism's prosperity has been built on centuries of colonial extraction, enslavement, and ecological destruction. The wealth of the global north didn't emerge from free and fair exchange, but from the violent appropriation of resources and labor from the global south, a process that continues today through unequal exchange, debt peonage, and structural adjustment programs. Fourth, the aggregate growth celebrated by capitalism's defenders masks enormous inequality in the distribution of its benefits. When the wealth of a few billionaires exceeds that of billions of people combined, can we really speak of generalized prosperity? Argument number 2. Capitalism is the most efficient system for allocating resources. This argument assumes that efficiency should be measured by profit generation rather than by meeting human needs. By the latter standard, capitalism is wildly inefficient. We live in a world that produces enough food to feed everyone, and yet millions starve. We have the technology to provide clean energy for all, yet fossil fuel subsidies continue. We have vacant homes outnumbering homeless people, yet housing insecurity grows. We have the capacity to provide healthcare, education, and a dignified life for every person on Earth, yet these basic needs remain unmet for billions. That is not efficiency. What it is organized scarcity in the midst of abundance. Moreover, capitalism's efficiency ignores massive externalized costs: pollution, climate change, biodiversity loss, mental health crisis, social atomization. When these costs are properly accounted for, the supposed efficiency of capitalism vanishes. The market mechanism itself, celebrated for its allocative powers, fails systemically in crucial areas: public goods, natural monopolies, information asymmetries. In all of these domains, market solutions produce perverse outcomes that benefit the few at the expense of the many. Argument number 3. Capitalism rewards innovation and entrepreneurship. In reality, much of the innovation credited to capitalism emerged from public funding and research. The internet, GPS, touchscreens, and most major pharmaceutical breakthroughs came from government-funded research, not private enterprise. Private firms typically enter only after the risky early-stage research has been completed with public money. Then they patent and commercialize these innovations, privatizing the profits while the public bears the costs of development. Furthermore, capitalism often stifles innovation that threatens established profit centers. Alternative energy technologies face systemic obstruction from fossil fuel interests. Treatments that might cure disease are neglected in favor of medications that manage chronic conditions profitably. Planned obsolescence ensures that products break down and that they must be replaced rather than lasting for generations. The entrepreneur as a heroic inventor is largely mythological. Most significant innovations emerge from collaborative processes involving many minds over time, not from lone geniuses. The capitalist system, with its restrictive intellectual property regimes, often impedes this collaborative innovation rather than facilitating it. Argument 4. There is no viable alternative to capitalism. This argument ignores both history and the present. Throughout human existence, we've organized economic activity in countless ways. Capitalism itself is a relatively recent development, emerging as the dominant mode of production only in the last few centuries. Even today, many non-capitalist forms of production and distribution exist alongside and within capitalism. For instance, workers' cooperatives, commons-based peer production, mutual aid networks, indigenous economic systems, public services, household economies of care, and all of them exist in defiance of and in spite of the capitalist superstructure they organize under. The Soviet Union and other 20th century socialist experiments, for all their flaws, demonstrated that planned economies could industrialize rapidly, and they could provide universal education and healthcare, and achieve significant scientific advances. Their failures stemmed not from the impossibility of non-capitalist organization, but from specific historical conditions, internal contradictions, and external pressures, namely being the subterfuge and disruption from Western hegemonic powers. Moreover, this argument commits the naturalistic fallacy, assuming that what exists now must continue to exist. Every social system in history has appeared eternal to those living within it, and yet all have eventually been transformed or replaced. Argument 5. Socialism and communism inevitably lead to totalitarianism. This argument confuses correlation with causation. The 20th century socialist projects emerged in predominantly agrarian societies under conditions of imperial encirclement and extreme scarcity. Their authoritarian characteristics reflected these conditions more than any inherent tendency of socialism toward totalitarianism. Democratic socialist experiments that threatened no totalitarianism, such as Chile under Allende, Guatemala under Arbenz, or Iran were violently suppressed by capitalist powers before they could develop. This pattern of intervention makes claims about socialism's inevitable outcomes impossible to evaluate fairly. Furthermore, this argument ignores the totalitarian tendencies within capitalism itself. Mass surveillance, police militarization, corporate control of media, the prison industrial complex, and the subjugation of democratic governance to market imperatives. These authoritarian structures exist not as aberrations, but as necessary components of maintaining capitalist property relations. Having examined these arguments and found them wanting, let's turn to the alternatives, socialism and communism, not as they have been caricatured, but as they were theorized by Marx and developed by subsequent thinkers. Socialism, in its most basic definition, refers to social ownership of the means of production. So the workers owning the factories, offices, land, and resources currently owned privately by the capitalist class. This social ownership can take various forms: state ownership, worker cooperatives, community control, or a combination of these. The essential point is not the specific form of ownership, but the elimination of the exploitation inherent in the capitalist wage relation. When workers collectively own and democratically control their workplaces, the extraction of surplus value for private profit ceases. Production can then be oriented toward meeting human needs, rather than maximizing returns for shareholders. Socialism represents both a transitional stage and a goal in itself. It maintains elements of the society from which it emerges while pointing toward a more fully transformed social order. It still uses money, still has a state, though one that serves different class interests, and still contains contradictions that must be worked through in practice. Communism, as theorized by Karl Marx, represents a more fully developed post-capitalist society. It involves the withering away of the state as a separate power standing above society, the transcendence of money and commodity production, and the realization of the principle from each according to their ability to each according to their needs. This process of deconstructing the state apparatus, the capitalist superstructure apparatus, and moving toward a society that has no such state or money is what is referred to as the socialization. So socialism is ultimately the process, and communism is the outcome. In communist society, work would be transformed from a compulsory activity performed for wages into free, creative activity undertaken for its own sake and for the common good. The artificial scarcity maintained by capitalism would give way to material abundance, while the compulsion to accumulate would be replaced by the drive for human development in all of its dimensions. Crucially, neither socialism nor communism can be identified with any particular historical regime or party that has claimed these labels. Just as we wouldn't dismiss democracy because of its betrayal by self-proclaimed democratic states, we shouldn't dismiss socialism because of the failures of states that adopted socialist rhetoric while diverging from socialist principles. That is, of course, if we are being intellectually honest. The essence of socialism lies not in state ownership per se, but in working class power, in the real control of society by the direct producer. Marx called this the dictatorship of the proletariat. Where this power is absent, where a bureaucratic elite makes decisions on behalf of workers rather than workers deciding for themselves, we find not socialism, but a different form of class society, regardless of the rhetoric employed. Marx developed his critique of capitalism and vision of alternatives through painstaking analysis of capitalism's internal dynamics. He showed how the drive for profit necessarily generates exploitation, crisis, inequality, and alienation. He demonstrated that capitalism contains the seeds of its own transcendence, creating both the material abundance that makes socialism possible and the social agent, the working class, that can bring it into being. This analysis was not dogma, but a scientific approach to understanding society, one that has been refined, extended, and sometimes corrected by subsequent generations of Marxist thinkers, responding to changing historical conditions. From Lenin's analysis of imperialism to Gramsci's theory of hegemony, from Luxemburg's critique of reformism to contemporary Marxist feminists and eco-socialist thought, this tradition remains vital and evolving. What unites these diverse currents is a commitment to the emancipation of humanity from all forms of exploitation and oppression, and a recognition that this emancipation requires moving beyond capitalism to a society based on common ownership, democratic planning, and production for use rather than for profit. Before concluding, we must confront the full human cost of the capitalist system, not as abstract statistics, but as lived reality. Consider the worker who spends their life producing wealth they'll never share in, their body breaking down from repetitive tasks, their mind numbed by meaningless routines, their time stolen by the imperatives of profit generation. Consider the young person crushed by student debt, working multiple jobs just to make rent, postponing dreams of family or creative pursuits, watching as home ownership and retirement security become increasingly unattainable. Consider the mother in the global south, forced from her land by agribusiness, then working in sweatshop conditions to produce fashion for wealthy consumers, her children growing up without her presence because economic necessity leaves no alternative. Consider the indigenous communities whose territories are poisoned by extractive industries, whose cultural heritage is commodified and appropriated, whose very existence represents an obstacle to capital's insatiable appetite for resources. Consider the refugee fleeing climate disasters exacerbated by the carbon emissions of fossil fuel corporations, only to face walls, detention, and xenophobia at borders drawn to protect accumulated wealth rather than human lives. Consider the elderly person rationing medicine because pharmaceutical companies price life-saving drugs beyond affordability, forced to choose between health and housing, their dignity sacrificed on the altar of shareholder value. These are not anomalies or unfortunate side effects. They are the necessary consequences of a system that values profit over people, that treats human beings as means rather than ends, that measures success in GDP growth rather than in flourishing lives. The alternative is not utopian dreaming, but practical necessity. Another world is not only possible, but essential for our collective survival and flourishing. We've traveled a long way in this episode, from the everyday appearance of capitalism to its essential structure, from its ideological manifestations to the arguments made in its defense, and from its human costs to the alternatives that point beyond it. Understanding capitalism, truly understanding it, means recognizing that it is not natural or inevitable, but a historically specific mode of production that emerged under particular conditions and that will eventually be superseded, just as all previous economic systems have been. It means seeing how capitalism shapes not just our economic relations, but our consciousness, our values, our sense of what is possible. It means acknowledging that the multiple crises we have, ecological, economic, social, political, they all stem from the same root, and they cannot be solved within the framework of a system driven by profit and endless growth. Most importantly, it means recognizing our own power as workers, as creators of all social wealth, as the class whose daily activity reproduces capitalism and whose collective action can transform it. The path beyond capitalism will not be smooth or straight. It will involve setbacks, contradictions, and difficult choices. It will require not just critique, but construction, the patient building of alternative institutions, practices, and forms of consciousness, and potentially violent overthrow. But this path offers something capitalism never can: the possibility of a society in which human development, creativity, and flourishing become the measure of success rather than profit margins, in which democracy extends from the political sphere into economic life, in which our relationship with nature becomes sustainable and regenerative rather than extractive and destructive. Remember, another world is not only possible, it is necessary, and we are the ones who must create it.